My wife and I are reading a book right now called Ruthless River. It's a true story of a couple who in 1973 were on an extended honeymoon in South America, pretty much roughing it, when on a flight to another little town, their plane crashed and they ended up in this little town in the middle of nowhere, and they were hoping to catch a plane or a boat to someplace specific they were planning on going. And when they got to the town, they were like, well, there's not going to be a boat going that way for 3 months. Or like 3 months. They were in this tiny little village and they were like, oh man, we don't want to do that. Well, somebody overheard them talking at this little cafe. And he said, you could just build a raft and float down to that. They were trying to get to this town downriver. And they're like, no, he said, oh yeah, people do it all the time. It's super easy, no problem. You can't miss it. I mean, the river just goes one way and you just get on the balsa log. They're easy to make. Everybody knows how to make them. And, it'll be no problem. Right. So he convinces them. He was a wealthy and very successful person. And he convinced them. So they built their raft made out of balsa logs and they're floating down the river, and it's actually going pretty good. But then there was a big storm, and the river rose, and they basically found themselves, after the storm was over, in a swamp. They were no longer in the river, apparently. Or the river, it wasn't moving, wherever they were, it wasn't moving. It's like a big swamp. And there's all these trees that are coming up out of the water. It's like the river has flooded its banks, filled up the jungle, and they're in the jungle in this water. And they're like, now what do we do? And the balsa, they'd already found out that this balsa raft is really hard to move around. Like they have one paddle and the rudder, and they can barely make this thing go anywhere. Plus there's a little bit of a current moving them away from the river. They're assuming that the current is flowing from the river, and they need to go up the current back to the main river to continue on their way. So they try to do that many different ways. They really struggled with it. First, they tried moving the whole raft. That was impossible. Then they found a little raft somebody had made, and it just washed ashore, or washed, nearby where they were. And they commandeered that and tried to use that little thing to paddle up the current back to the river. That didn't work. They just could not get it to go. I mean, they made it some distance, and then they were so exhausted. Of course, at the same time, when the storm happened, they also lost all their food. So now they're starving and struggling, spending 10, 12, 18 hours a day paddling, trying to go up this stream to get back to the river, and they can't do it. They're too weak, they're too tired, the current is too strong, they don't have the right tools, they can't do it. First they tried to paddle the big one, then they paddled the little one, and then they thought, well, maybe we could swim it. So they each took a log with them and swam, but they just couldn't do it. It was just, they were so exhausted and so tired. They ended up back on their big raft log, which is basically just tied up to a tree. Then they thought, we've got to eat something. Let's start fishing. They can see that fish are jumping once in a while. They'll just go fishing. They have a giant fish hook. So they try to find something that they can put on the fish hook so they can catch something. And they find a few things, but it always gets lost and they're not catching anything. And then it occurs to them that they could eat these things that they're finding, like snails and little grubs and stuff. And that was their first shift. Their first reframe was, instead of trying to get out of here and trying to get back to the river, now that they realized that was not going to be physically possible for them, at least not now, at least not with this current, and at least not in their state of weakness. And they shifted their perspective to, we're going to try to survive here on this raft. They had water, they just needed food. So then they started concentrating on finding food. And then immediately, within a couple of days of no luck at all fishing, they shifted again to, instead of trying to catch fish, they started eating the stuff that they were going to use for bait. I mean, they were still trying to fish. They set their sides a little lower, and they were eating little baby frogs and snails and stuff like that. So this is a purpose reframe. It's a shift in the purpose that they're aiming for. First, they were aiming just to get back to the river. Then they discovered they couldn't really do that because they were becoming too weak. Then they decided that they were going to try to feed themselves. And now they're trying to survive there on the raft until something changes. Either until a rescue plane finds them, or until the river slows down, or the current that's pushing them away from the river slows down enough that they can paddle against it, or until the level of the water drops and they're on dry land and they can travel. But their goal now is to survive where they are. And it has galvanized their energies. Instead of feeling hopeless and ineffective and the victim of circumstances, they're now actively trying to survive, and they're immediately becoming more inventive. They're like, oh, we could make a net out of this hammock that we have, and we could use my linen shirt for a little, make a little net out of it so we could catch minnows to put those on the fish hook. We could travel around on the little raft and see if we can find anything to eat or use for bait in the jungle around here on the tree branches. We could take some tree branches and form them into a frame for the netting to catch fish. They're just becoming really inventive now that they've really focused in on a positive goal. And that is a really great way to change your perspective on something, is to add a goal, a positive, clear goal. So if you feel like you have something that you're basically the victim of in your life, and you can't seem to do anything about it, one possible way of reframing it and looking at it in a different way, is to find a goal, a positive goal within that arena. So if it's a financial thing that you feel you're the victim of, find a goal within that financial thing. Or if it's a health issue, find a goal, a positive goal that you really want, and it will change your whole stance toward the thing, making you more effective and changing the way you feel. And if no purpose presents itself right away, that's not the end of it. Just keep thinking. These guys didn't come up with this idea of trying to survive there on the raft right away. They had to exhaust some of their earlier purposes until they came to that. So same for you. If you can't think of something right away that's a clear purpose, or if you try something, you come up with a purpose and you try it and it doesn't work, that's not the end of it either. Try another way. Try a different goal, a different purpose. You've got a good one when you stop feeling like a victim and you start feeling galvanized and energized and focused. Give it a try and let us know how it works. This is Adam Lee Kahn on The Atom Bomb. This Atom Bomb podcast episode is sponsored by Anchor, a podcast platform, the one I'm using to make this podcast. It's super easy to use and allows you to easily create your own podcast. You can record and edit your audio right onto the app. In fact, you can do everything on your phone. Anchor also makes it easy to monetize your podcast and get wide distribution. Anchor automatically makes your podcast available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and more. You can download the Anchor app for free or go to anchor.fm to get started.